So this is a question I've been researching and writing about for the past 3 or 4 years now. And what I wanted to do today was talk about 3 ideas from this work. And I figured we'd go from the philosophical towards the more practical. So we'll begin with the sort of contrarian, hair-raising ideas, and we'll end up with the sort of concrete habits that you could actually put into practice tomorrow to get more out of your working life. So for the first big idea, to help me illustrate this idea, I wanted to use the late Steve Jobs as my example. In particular, I wanted to talk about the summer of 2005, and this is when Steve Jobs took the stage at Stanford Stadium, and he was there to deliver the commencement address to Stanford's graduating class. So this was a talk that very quickly went viral. I think it has something like 6 million views or counting on YouTube. It's now seen as an iconic talk. It's a famous talk. Many of you in this audience have probably seen it, so you know that in this address, Jobs made a lot of really interesting points. But if you go back and look at the traditional media and the social media reactions that immediately followed this speech, it becomes clear that there was one point in particular that people got really excited about. And that's when he said, about a third of the way through the talk, the following. Now again, there's different ways to interpret what Jobs actually meant by this, but if you go back to the traditional media and the social media reactions that surrounded the talk, a clear consensus emerges. People are pretty sure they understand what Jobs meant to say. And in particular, we see this phrase show up often in those summaries. So the reason I'm telling you this story is the fact that people got so excited about this one piece, this one idea from the otherwise very long and sort of full of good idea speeches. The fact that they got so interested in this particular idea emphasizes something that I've found time and again when I've been researching this issue. And that's the fact that American culture is obsessed with this idea that the only way to end up happy in what you do for a living is to follow your passion. You'd be hard-pressed to find a career guide book, a career counselor, or a career advice blogger whose whole philosophy somewhere deep down is not based on this idea. But there's also a problem here. So the more I researched into this issue, the more I became convinced that in addition to being an astonishingly popular piece of advice, follow your passion is also an astonishingly bad piece of advice. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. In science, in science, it's very hard to get things named after you, so I really overcompensate when it comes to my writing. There's nothing that's not too much. But what I'm saying here is that I have nothing against the goal of ending up passionate about what you do. In fact, that's what this whole talk is about. How do people actually get there? What I'm arguing, however, is that the specific strategy of identifying a pre-existing passion and then following it is a bad strategy for achieving that goal. There's a couple reasons I believe this. First, follow your passion presupposes that you have a pre-existing passion that you can identify and follow. We actually don't have a lot of evidence that this is true for most people. In fact, one study I wrote about had a psychologist take a large group of seniors, this is at a Canadian university, a large group of seniors, and they subjected them to all of these questionnaires to try to figure out what, if anything, they were passionate about. And I went back and went through the data, and even being very generous in my accounting, it was less than 5% of these students that actually had a passion that was even remotely relevant to a career choice. You probably guessed the number one passion is Canadian University was hockey, turns out. The second problem is that follow your passion presupposes that if you really like something and then match that to your job, you will then, from then on out, have a sort of long-term, engaging, and meaningful career. And this turns out to be an incredibly simplistic and reductive understanding of workplace satisfaction and what's involved in actually building a long-term career that provides both meaning and engagement. If you want this emphasized, look no farther than all the examples of passionate amateur photographers or passionate amateur bakers that end up miserable and overworked when they open their own photography studio or their own bakery. This tells us that something more is going on here. But I think actually the most ironic example of the insufficiency of this advice is actually Steve Jobs himself. So even though Steve Jobs stood on that stage in 2005 and said what people at least interpreted to mean, follow your passion, his biographers make it clear that that's not at all what he did. Right? His biographers tell us that in the period leading up to Apple Computer, Steve Jobs did not have an unusual passion for technology entrepreneurship. Apple was something that he stumbled into. One of his biographers put it this way: Apple was a small-time scheme that unexpectedly took off. But of course, no one doubts that Steve Jobs ended up quite passionate about what he did for a living. Which tells us the lesson here is it's not how you get started that matters. Maybe what matters is what you do once you get going. And that's the theme I want to explore in the second idea that we're going to talk about today. So if our first idea is follow your passion does not consistently bring people to a working life they love, let's ask, what does? And to help illustrate my idea here, I want to use this gentleman as my case study. So this is the environmental writer, the celebrated environmental writer, Bill McKibben. Now, Bill McKibben is someone who loves what he does for a living, okay? He is a celebrated author. He writes books full-time, maybe one every 2 or 3 years. They're big idea books. They're books on topics that he's interested in. He lives in this sort of idyllic town in Vermont, and he has a life, by all accounts, that he's very passionate about. So let's use him as our case study. Let's ask the question, how did Bill McKibben end up with a working life that he loved? Now, I would conjecture that the short answer to that question is skill. If we dive into the details of Bill McKibben's life, we see the turning point for him happened with the publication of his first book in the late 1980s. This was a book called The End of Nature, and it was quickly heralded as a new classic in the field of environmental books, the most important environmental book since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It immediately made him a celebrity author, at least within this field. It allowed him to quit his magazine job and quit the freelance assignments. He moved first to the Adirondacks and then to this small town in Vermont, and it allowed him to kick off this life of just writing about what interests to him, having an impact on the world, and really enjoying his life. But if we ask, well, how did he write The End of Nature? The important thing to keep in mind is by the time he actually got the book deal for that book, he had become one of the most talented environmental writers of his generation. He was a staff writer for The New Yorker who specialized in these issues. He had a big book deal from Random House to go write this book. The New Yorker serialized the book while he was writing it, so it was definitely going to be seen. It was definitely going to make an impact. The fact that he was such a talented writer by this point is what made him capable of transforming his life in this way that generated a lot of passion for him. Now, there's a question we have to ask here. How did he end up becoming one of the most talented environmental writers of his generation? And I want to conjecture here that he was not born a brilliant or naturally talented writer. And I'll use this as my Exhibit A. This comes from, as far as I can tell in my research, the first published work of a young Bill McKibben. He published this in the Harvard Crimson soon after arriving as an undergraduate at Harvard University. It was a sports page article about the Celtics opening day game. So it doesn't take a Pulitzer committee to tell you that this is not good writing, okay? It's all the classic mistakes of a very young new writer. It's completely overblown, way too effusive, and of course a completely inappropriate tone for an article where people want to know whether Larry Bird was feeling healthy or not, which was the concern in 1979. But the point is, even if you talk to Crimson staffers today, and this is what it's important to know about Bill McKibben, they still talk about his lore at the Crimson, his work ethic. He wrote an absurd number of articles while there. There's this tale that they tell about, it was like a late Cambridge City Council meeting. They came back, he had an hour until deadline, and he bet the fellow editors, a bottle of scotch, that I'll get these 2 articles written and in before the deadline. And he won that bottle of scotch because that's the type of work ethic he had. He wrote an absurd number of articles and through sheer brute practice became a better and better writer. And by the time he graduated Harvard, he was the editor of the Crimson. That put him on the radar of Bill Shawn at the New Yorker, who hired him to edit those short talk of the town pieces in the front of the magazine. He worked at that really hard. They let him start tackling longer pieces. Eventually became a staff writer. He could specialize in the environment. Then the end of nature happened. And he was able to transform his life into this one that he's very passionate about. So that gives us our long answer to the question, how did Bill McKibben end up loving what he did for a living? He systematically, over a period of almost 10 years, built up a rare and valuable skill, and then used that skill as leverage to take control of his working life and shift it in directions that resonated with him. Now, McKibben is an important example for us to talk about because when I went and researched this systematically and found lots of people who, like McKibben, love what they do, this was the pattern that showed up most frequently. The most frequent pattern was they systematically built up a rare and valuable skill, then used it as leverage. After a while, I began to summarize it this way. You cannot expect a really good working life until you're really good at something. And that reality was reinforced again and again if you look into the real details and not just the short stories of how people end up in these remarkable lives. Now, when I talk about these research results, there is an objection that comes up quite a bit almost exactly at this point. So I've learned to try to head it off and actually just address it explicitly in case you're worrying about it yourself. And this objection came up so much that in my last book, I actually gave it a name. As I said, I like to name things. I should have called this the Newport argument from pre-existing passion, or Newport's law about pre-existing passion. This argument goes something like this. The only way that you are going to be able to persist systematically over years in improving a rare and valuable skill is if you have a huge amount of passion for that topic. Therefore, to say that the secret is you need to systematically build up skills, that's no different than saying you have to figure out what you're passionate about and go after it. So this objection says, therefore, Cal, you're really saying nothing different than just follow your passion. It makes intuitive sense, but actually there's no evidence to back it up. If anything, the evidence points us in the other way. So I want to turn to this gentleman to help me make this argument. This is the late Benjamin Bloom, the sort of esteemed educational psychologist from the University of Chicago. Now, Bloom launched this massive multi-year, multi-PI study whose whole goal was to understand how people build up world-class talent. They took a huge number of virtuosos in both intellectual, academic, athletic, and musical fields, and they threw a bunch of grad students at them to basically break down every element of their life and quantify it and code it and try to systematically understand how did they get where they are? How did they become a great neurosurgeon or a great mathematician or swimmer or violin player? And one of the most striking findings from this study is that these people who ended up with an exceptional amount of skill, for the most part, did not start with an exceptional amount of talent for their field or an exceptional amount of passion. The more consistent pattern that you see when you look in this research goes something like this. Early in life, they have a serendipitous positive encounter with their field. For example, a piano teacher who was fun. They come into this with no pre-existing talent or passion for it. They just happen to have a teacher that was fun. Okay? Because of that, they have just a little bit more persistence with the practice in that very early stage of learning their craft. And perhaps because of that, they practice the piano just a little bit more than their friends who had the mean or old stern piano teacher. So then they get to the recital and they play, and they're playing, chopsticks, whatever they play, but they sort of recognize, I'm just a little bit better than some of these other people. And that became a little bit part of their identity. It gave them a boost of confidence, enough for them to persist a little bit harder through the next stage of practice when they got a little bit better and the gap widened a little bit. And that gave them enough motivation and enough interest to persist to the next even harder level where they had to practice a little bit more. And over time, there's a snowball effect. As they got better, their interest and passion grew. And by the time they were world class, they had a huge amount of passion for what they did. But as Bloom's research makes clear, that passion grew along with their skill. It did not exist at that magnitude in the very beginning. So that's my second idea. How do people end up loving what they do? Well, here's what the research seems to show. They don't just figure out in advance, here's what I'm passionate about, they're set. They instead build up these rare and valuable skills. You cannot expect a really good working life until you're really good at something. The role of passion in this process is more often better seen as a side effect than a starting point. Passion grows as they get better and as they gain more control. This notion that you have to identify it in advance does not have a lot of evidence to bear it out. So let's get a little bit more concrete with this third idea. Let's say you buy this notion that the systematic development of rare and valuable skills is key to a working life you love. How do you actually do that? Say today, let's say in a creative or knowledge work type field. So I think the evidence suggests that this type of work plays a crucial role. Right, we have decades of research from performance psychology as well as neuroscience that tells us that this state of cognitive strain, where you persist even though it's uncomfortable, is exactly the state in which you improve at a cognitive skill. So the heuristic is simple. If you want to be cultivating a rare and valuable skill in a knowledge work or creative pursuit, a non-trivial fraction of your work hours have to be dedicated to this type of work. There's actually no way to get around that. So that's easier said than done. So what I want to talk about now in these final minutes are what are some actual concrete things you can do within your working life to make sure that deep work plays a successful and frequently occurring role. So the first of these three concrete ideas is something that you've heard about before. It's something that is simple, and because of that, people ignore it, but they really shouldn't. And that's the simple technique of time blocking. Right? We know what this is. Right? Instead of being reactive about your day, you plan out in advance. This is what I'm going to do here, this is what I'm going to do there. This is a sample time block document from my notebook. As you can see, I block my hours on the left. On the right, I elaborate where needed. On the immediate right, I leave myself extra space so that I can repair the schedule as it gets disrupted during the day. It's simple. Now, of course, time blocking has lots of sort of general productivity benefits. It forces you to make critical decisions about your time. I think more importantly, it forces you to come to grips with how long things actually take, which turns out to play a crucial role in scheduling. But when it comes to deep work in particular, it's absolutely necessary. Deep work is not a natural activity. It's not something that you're going to do spontaneously. If you're not planning in advance what you do when, it's not going to show up in your schedule. So this is sort of the foundation on which deep work makes its way into knowledge work, working schedules. As you can see in line 4, there's a mistake, and I'm embarrassed about that. You all caught that. I didn't have time to fix it. Now, this is an example of the second technique I wanted to talk about. And no, you don't have to actually do algebra for this technique. This is an example of me applying the technique, which says even if you put aside time for deep work, it doesn't mean that you're actually going to get the right cognitive strain out of that period, right? Because our brains have evolved to be very conservative about energy expenditure. Deep work is fabulously energy intensive. If you just tell your mind, let's think hard about this, it'll find a way to avoid the hard things. It'll be like, well, this is kind of interesting. Well, what about this? No, we got to stop thinking about this as soon as you actually have to solve an equation, which happens often in your field, I'm sure. The solution that I have found works well is to have as the goal of every deep work session an artifact, a clearly defined outcome that forces your mind to tackle the hard things it doesn't want to. So I'm a theoretical computer scientist in my day job. That means most of my deep work sessions are aimed at proving theorems. The artifact I try to produce from each of these sessions is what I call a problem notes document. That's an example of one. It's a document where I force myself to take the technique I was trying and actually work through the mathematics, formalize it, and figure out exactly where the counterexample is or exactly where I get stuck. Now, this is a terrible pain in the ass to do, and my mind would prefer not to do this. It'd prefer to say, this is probably not going to work, let's try another technique. But because I have this artifact, it forces me to do that strain. Right, so the final technique is to understand the act of focusing itself. Okay, so let's say you put aside the time. Let's say you have an artifact. Now you actually still have to think hard and produce this artifact during your session. And the best piece of advice I have about this, from thinking and writing about focus for a while now, is that you have to think about it like you would think about pull-ups. It's easy to understand what it is, but it's very hard to do a lot of it if you're not training. Now, I've worked with students and graduate students and professors on this for quite a while, the systematic training of your ability to focus. And that's why I'm showing you up here one of these filters like Leech Block that can help you turn off access to distracting websites. That's actually the mindset you need, like an athlete, to build your ability up to focus. I often tell people when they're working on this ability that adding 10 minutes to your amount of time you can focus after every 10 sessions is about the rate at which your ability can grow. If you start with 30-minute sessions, do 10 of those successfully before you go to 40, and then do 10 of those before you go to 50. That's about how slow it is to increase this ability to focus, but it's crucial to make this happen. So my time is short. Let me summarize what I had to say today. So how do people end up loving what they do for a living? Well, we know that follow your passion sounds good, but it's too simplistic. The more common story is that they systematically build up a skill. Passion grows along with that skill. You can't have a good job until you're good at something. And in knowledge work, deep work and the different rituals and habits that surround it is what's going to help you build up those skills and therefore build this working life that you really love. So to bring it back to where we started, if we look back to Steve Jobs, we see actually this is what he did. So he might have stumbled into Apple Computer, but once that opportunity was there, he was obsessive about building things that are actually of value to the world. And as he did this better and better, as he became more valuable to the world, he became more and more passionate about what he did for a living. So if I had to summarize this in one phrase, I'd say, if you want to love what you do what Steve Jobs did and not what he said. Thank you.